Volume 1, Chapter 6 of The Life of Charlotte Bronte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Volume 1, Chapter 6. Her indefatigable craving for knowledge tempted Miss W. on into setting her longer and longer tasks of reading for examination, and towards the end of the year and a half that she remained as a pupil at Roe Head, she received her first bad mark for an imperfect lesson. She had had a great quantity of Blair's Lectures on Belles Lettres to read, and she could not answer some of the questions upon it. Charlotte Bronte had a bad mark. Miss W. was sorry, and regretted that she had set Charlotte so long a task. Charlotte cried bitterly, but her schoolfellows were more than sorry, they were indignant. They declared that the infliction of ever so slight a punishment on Charlotte Bronte was unjust, for who had tried to do her duty like her, and testified their feeling in a variety of ways, until Miss W., who was in reality only too willing to pass over her good pupil's first fault, withdrew the bad mark, and the girls all returned to their allegiance except Mary, who took her own way during the week or two that remained of the half year, choosing to consider that Miss W., in giving Charlotte Bronte so long a task, had forfeited her claim to obedience of the school regulations. The number of pupils was so small that the attendance to certain subjects at particular hours, common in larger schools, was not rigidly enforced. When the girls were ready with their lessons, they came to Miss W. to say them. She had a remarkable knack of making them feel interested in whatever they had to learn. They set to their studies, not as to tasks or duties to be got through, but with a healthy desire and thirst for knowledge, of which she had managed to make them perceive the relishing savour. They did not leave off reading and learning as soon as the compulsory pressure of school was taken away. They had been taught to think, to analyze, to reject, to appreciate. Charlotte Bronte was happy in the choice made for her of the second school to which she was sent. There was a robust freedom in the out-of-doors life of her companions. They played at merry games in the fields round the house. On Saturday, half-holidays, they went long scrambling walks down mysterious shady lanes, then climbing the uplands, and thus gaining extensive views over the country, about which so much had to be told, both of its past and present history. Miss W. must have had in great perfection the French art conter, to judge from her pupils' recollections of the tales she related during these long walks, of this old house or that new mill, and of the states of society consequent on the changes involved by the suggestive dates of either building. She remembered the times when watchers or wakeners in the night heard the distant word of command, and the measured tramp of thousands of sad, desperate men receiving a surreptitious military training, in preparation for some great day which they saw in their visions, when right should struggle with might and come off victorious, when the people of England, represented by the workers of Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Nottinghamshire, should make their voice heard in a terrible slogan, since their true and pitiful complaints could find no hearing in Parliament. We forget nowadays, so rapid have been the changes for the better, how cruel was the condition of numbers of labourers at the close of the great Peninsular War. The half-ludicrous nature of some of their grievances has lingered on in tradition. The real intensity of their sufferings has become forgotten. They were maddened and desperate, and the country, in the opinion of many, seemed to be on the verge of a precipice, from which it was only saved by the prompt and resolute decision of a few in authority. Miss W. spoke of those times, of the mysterious nightly drillings, of thousands on lonely moors, of the muttered threats of individuals too closely pressed upon by necessity to be prudent, of the overt acts in which the burning of Cartwright's mill took a prominent place, and these things sank deep into the mind of one at least among her hearers. Mr. Cartwright was the owner of a factory called Rawfolds, in Liversedge, not beyond the distance of a walk from Roe Head. He had dared to employ machinery for the dressing of woolen cloth, which was an unpopular measure in 1812, when many other circumstances conspired to make the condition of the mill hands unbearable from the pressure of starvation and misery. Mr. Cartwright was a very remarkable man, having, as I have been told, some foreign blood in him, the traces of which were very apparent in his tall figure, dark eyes and complexion, and singular though gentlemanly bearing. At any rate, he had been much abroad, and spoke French well, of itself a suspicious circumstance to the bigoted nationality of those days. Altogether he was an unpopular man, even before he took the last step of employing shears instead of hands to dress his wool. He was quite aware of his unpopularity, and of the probable consequences. He had his mill prepared for an assault. He took up his lodgings in it, and the doors were strongly barricaded at night. On every step of the stairs there was placed a roller, spiked with barbed points all around, so as to impede the ascent of the rioters if they succeeded in forcing the doors. On the night of Saturday, the 11th of April, 1812, the assault was made. Some hundreds of starving cloth dressers assembled in the very field near Kirklees that sloped down from the house which Miss W. afterwards inhabited, and were armed by their leaders with pistols, hatchets, and bludgeons, many of which had been extorted by the nightly bands that prowled about the country, from such inhabitants of lonely houses as had provided themselves with these means of self-defence. The silent, sullen multitude marched in the dead of that spring night to Rawfolds, and giving tongue with a great shout, roused Mr. Cartwright up to the knowledge that the long-expected attack was come. He was within walls, it is true, but against the fury of hundreds he had only 4 of his own workmen and 5 soldiers to assist him. These 10 men, however, managed to keep up such a vigorous and well-directed fire of musketry that they defeated all the desperate attempts of the multitude outside to break down the doors and force a way into the mill, and after a conflict of 20 minutes, during which 2 of the assailants were killed and several wounded, they withdrew in confusion, leaving Mr. Cartwright master of the field, but so dizzy and exhausted, now the peril was past, that he forgot the nature of his defences, and injured his leg rather seriously by one of the spiked rollers in attempting to go up his own staircase. His dwelling was near the factory. Some of the rioters vowed that if he did not give in they would leave this and go to his house and murder his wife and children. This was a terrible threat, for he had been obliged to leave his family with only 1 or 2 soldiers to defend them. Mrs. Cartwright knew what they had threatened, and on that dreadful night, hearing, as she thought, steps approaching, she snatched up her 2 infant children and put them in a basket up the great chimney, common in old-fashioned Yorkshire houses. One of the 2 children who had been thus stowed away used to point out with pride, after she had grown up to woman's estate, the marks of musket shot and the traces of gunpowder on the walls of her father's mill. He was the first that had offered any resistance to the progress of the Luddites, who had become by this time so numerous as almost to assume the character of an insurrectionary army. Mr. Cartwright's conduct was so much admired by the neighbouring mill owners that they entered into a subscription for his benefit, which amounted in the end to £3,000. Not much more than a fortnight after this attack on Rawfolds, another manufacturer who employed the obnoxious machinery was shot down in broad daylight as he was passing over Crossland Moor, which was skirted by a small plantation in which the murderers lay hidden. The readers of Shirley will recognize these circumstances, which were related to Miss Bronte years after they occurred, but on the very spots where they took place, and by persons who remembered full well those terrible times of insecurity to life and property on one hand, and of bitter starvation and blind, ignorant despair on the other. Mr. Bronte himself had been living amongst these very people in 1812, as he was then clergyman at Hartshead, not 3 miles from Rawfolds, and as I have mentioned, it was in these perilous times that he began his custom of carrying a loaded pistol continually about with him. For not only his Tory politics, but his love and regard for the authority of the law, made him despise the cowardice of the surrounding magistrates, who in their dread of the Luddites refused to interfere, so as to prevent the destruction of property. The clergy of the district were the bravest men by far. There was a Mr. Roberson of Heald's Hall, a friend of Mr. Bronte's, who has left a deep impression of himself on the public mind. He lived near Heckmondwike, a large, straggling, dirty village, not 2 miles from Roe Head. It was principally inhabited by blanket weavers, who worked in their own cottages, and Heald's Hall is the largest house in the village, of which Mr. Roberson was the vicar. At his own cost he built a handsome church at Liversedge, on a hill opposite the one on which his house stood, which was the first attempt in the West Riding to meet the wants of the overgrown population, and made many personal sacrifices for his opinions, both religious and political, which were of the true old-fashioned Tory stamp. He hated everything which he fancied had a tendency towards anarchy. He was loyal in every fibre to church and king, and would have proudly laid down his life any day for what he believed to be right and true. But he was a man of an imperial will, and by it he bore down opposition, till tradition represents him as having something grimly demoniac about him. He was intimate with Cartwright, and aware of the attack likely to be made on his mill. Accordingly, it is said, he armed himself and his household, and was prepared to come to the rescue in the event of a signal being given that aid was needed. Thus far is likely enough. Mr. Roberson had plenty of warlike spirit in him, man of peace though he was. But, in consequence of his having taken the unpopular side, exaggerations of his character linger as truth in the minds of the people, and a fabulous story is told of his forbidding any one to give water to the wounded Luddites left in the mill yard, when he rode in the next morning to congratulate his friend Cartwright on his successful defence. Moreover, this stern, fearless clergyman had the soldiers that were sent to defend the neighbourhood billeted at his house, and this deeply displeased the workpeople, who were to be intimidated by the redcoats. Although not a magistrate, he spared no pains to track out the Luddites concerned in the assassination I have mentioned, and was so successful in his acute, unflinching energy that it was believed he had been supernaturally aided, and the country people, stealing into the fields surrounding Heald's Hall on dusky winter evenings years after this time, declared that through the windows they saw Parson Roberson dancing in a strange red light, with black demons all whirling and eddying around him. He kept a large boys' school, and made himself both respected and dreaded by his pupils. He added a grim kind of humour to his strength of will, and the former quality suggested to his fancy strange, out-of-the-way kinds of punishment for any refractory pupils. For instance, he made them stand on one leg in a corner of the schoolroom, holding a heavy book in each hand; and once, when a boy had run away home, he followed him on horseback, reclaimed him from his parents, and, tying him by a rope to the stirrup of his saddle, made him run alongside of his horse for the many miles they had to traverse before reaching Heald's Hall. One other illustration of his character may be given. He discovered that his servant Betty had a follower, and watching his time till Richard was found in the kitchen, he ordered him into the dining room where the pupils were all assembled. He then questioned Richard whether he had come after Betty, and on his confessing the truth, Mr. Roberson gave the word, "Off with him, lads, to the pump." The poor lover was dragged to the courtyard, and the pump was set to play upon him, and between every drenching the question was put to him, "Will you promise not to come after Betty again?" For a long time Richard bravely refused to give in, when "Pump again, lads," was the order; but at last the poor soaked follower was forced to yield and renounce his Betty. The Yorkshire character of Mr. Roberson would be incomplete if I did not mention his fondness for horses. He lived to be a very old man, dying sometime nearer to 1840 than 1830, and even after he was 80 years of age he took great delight in breaking refractory steeds. He would sit motionless on their backs for half an hour or more to bring them to. There is a story current that once, in a passion, he shot his wife's favourite horse and buried it near a quarry, where the ground, some years after, miraculously opened and displayed the skeleton. But the real fact is that it was an act of humanity to put a poor old horse out of misery, and that, to spare it pain, he shot it with his own hands, and buried it where, the ground sinking afterwards by the working of a coal pit, the bones came to light. The traditional colouring shows the animus with which his memory is regarded by one set of people. By another, the neighbouring clergy, who remember him riding in his old age down the hill on which his house stood, upon a strong white horse, his bearing proud and dignified, his shovel hat bent over and shadowing his keen eagle eyes, going to his Sunday duty like a faithful soldier that dies in harness, who can appreciate his loyalty to conscience, his sacrifices to duty, and his stand by his religion. His memory is venerated. In his extreme old age, a rubric meeting was held, at which his clerical brethren gladly subscribed to present him with a testimonial of their deep respect and regard. This is a specimen of the strong character not seldom manifested by the Yorkshire clergy of the Established Church. Mr. Roberson was a friend of Charlotte Bronte's father, lived within a couple of miles of Roe Head while she was at school there, and was deeply engaged in transactions, the memory of which was yet recent when she heard of them, and of the part which he had had in them. I may now say a little on the character of the dissenting population immediately surrounding Roe Head, for the Tory and clergyman's daughter, taking interest in politics ever since she was 5 years old, and holding frequent discussions with such of the girls as were dissenters and radicals, was sure to have made herself as much acquainted as she could with the condition of those to whom she was opposed in opinion. The bulk of the population were dissenters, principally independents. In the village of Heckmondwike, at one end of which Roe Head is situated, there were 2 large chapels belonging to that denomination, and one to the Methodists, all of which were well filled 2 or 3 times on a Sunday, besides having various prayer meetings fully attended on weekdays. The inhabitants were a chapel-going people, very critical about the doctrine of their sermons, tyrannical to their ministers, and violent radicals in politics. A friend, well acquainted with the place when Charlotte Bronte was at school, has described some events which occurred then among them. A scene, which took place at the lower chapel at Heckmondwike, will give you some idea of the people at that time. When a newly married couple made their appearance at chapel, it was the custom to sing the wedding anthem, just after the last prayer, and as the congregation was quitting the chapel. The band of singers who performed this ceremony expected to have money given them, and often passed the following night in drinking, at least so said the minister of the place, and he determined to put an end to this custom. In this he was supported by many members of the chapel and congregation, but so strong was the democratic element that he met with the most violent opposition, and was often insulted when he went into the street. A bride was expected to make her first appearance, and the minister told the singers not to perform the anthem. On their declaring they would, he had the large pew which they usually occupied locked. They broke it open. From the pulpit he told the congregation that, instead of their singing a hymn, he would read a chapter. Hardly had he uttered the first word before up rose the singers, headed by a tall, fierce-looking weaver, who gave out a hymn, and all sang it at the very top of their voices, aided by those of their friends who were in the chapel. Those who disapproved of the conduct of the singers and sided with the minister remained seated till the hymn was finished. Then he gave out the chapter again, read it, and preached. He was just about to conclude with prayer when up started the singers and screamed forth another hymn. These disgraceful scenes were continued for many weeks, and so violent was the feeling that the different parties could hardly keep from blows as they came through the chapel yard. The minister at last left the place, and along with him went many of the most temperate and respectable part of the congregation, and the singers remained triumphant. I believe that there was such a violent contest respecting the choice of a pastor about this time in the upper church at Heckmondwike that the riot act had to be read at a church meeting. Certainly the soi-disant Christians who forcibly ejected Mr. Redhead at Haworth 10 or 12 years before held a very heathen brotherhood with the soi-disant Christians of Heckmondwike, though the one set might be called members of the Church of England and the other dissenters. The letter from which I have taken the above extract relates throughout to the immediate neighborhood of the place where Charlotte Bronte spent her school days, and describes things as they existed at that very time. The writer says, "Having been accustomed to the respectful manners of the lower orders in the agricultural districts, I was at first much disgusted and somewhat alarmed at the great freedom displayed by the working classes of Heckmondwike and Gomersall to those in a station above them. The term lass was as freely applied to any young lady as the word wench is in Lancashire. The extremely untidy appearance of the villagers shocked me not a little, though I must do the housewives the justice to say that the cottages themselves were not dirty, and had an air of rough plenty about them, except when trade was bad, that I had not been accustomed to see in the farming districts. The heap of coals on one side of the house door, and the brewing tubs on the other, and the frequent perfume of malt and hops as you walked along, proved that fire and home-brewed were to be found at almost every man's hearth. Nor was hospitality, one of the main virtues of Yorkshire, wanting. Oat-cake, cheese, and beer were freely pressed upon the visitor. There used to be a yearly festival, half religious, half social, held at Heckmondwike, called the Lecture. I fancy it had come down from the times of the Nonconformists. A sermon was preached by some stranger at the lower chapel on a weekday evening, and the next day 2 sermons in succession were delivered at the upper chapel. Of course the service was a very long one, and as the time was June, and the weather often hot, it used to be regarded by myself and my companions as no pleasurable way of passing the morning. The rest of the day was spent in social enjoyment. Great numbers of strangers flocked to the place. Booths were erected for the sale of toys and gingerbread, a sort of holy fair, and the cottages, having had a little extra paint and whitewashing, assumed quite a holiday look. The village of Gomersall, where Charlotte Bronte's friend Mary lived with her family, which was a much prettier place than Heckmondwike, contained a strange-looking cottage built of rough, unhewn stones, many of them projecting considerably, with uncouth heads and grinning faces carved upon them; and upon a stone above the door was cut in large letters, "Spite Hall." It was erected by a man in the village, opposite to the house of his enemy, who had just finished for himself a good house commanding a beautiful view down the valley, which this hideous building quite shut out. Fearless, because this people were quite familiar to all of them, amidst such a population, lived and walked the gentle Miss W.'s 8 or 9 pupils. She herself was born and bred among this rough, strong, fierce set, and knew the depth of goodness and loyalty that lay beneath their wild manners and insubordinate ways. And the girls talked of the little world around them as if it were the only world that was, and had their opinions and their parties and their fierce discussions like their elders, possibly their betters. And among them, beloved and respected by all, laughed at occasionally by a few, but always to her face, lived for a year and a half the plain, short-sighted, oddly dressed, studious little girl they called Charlotte Bronte. End of chapter 6.